third and final energy system is the aerobic energy system. As the name suggests, this is where oxygen is used to break down the chemical fuels to provide ATP. Key knowledge is similar to the other two energy systems, just knowing how the chemical pathway is formed and a whole range of characteristics, peak power, rate, intensity, byproducts, that kind of thing. So the essential question then is, how do we restore ATP for movement with the use of oxygen? Meaning, in the metabolic process of breaking down the stored chemical fuels for the aerobic energy system, and how oxygen works with that to break it down and provide ATP restoration.
The chemical processes get a little bit more complex with the aerobic energy system, hence why it's the slowest of the three. You'll need to add some information to your energy systems table from the anaerobic systems in the previous week. And there's a great bonus question at the back end of this I'd really like you to try and get your head around. Make sure you're keeping on top of the vocabulary, and all the building blocks will fall into place once you have your terminology down.
The other system names for this is oxidative or oxygen. It's really important that while we talk about aerobic glycolysis a lot, which is how the glucose or glycogen splits down, be careful in answering questions because almost always there is a combination of fats and carbohydrates being broken down aerobically, so that the correct answer would be the aerobic energy system working at this time point rather than the aerobic glycolysis system. Remembering from your fat carbohydrate crossover discussion earlier in this area of study, it's only at 100% of VO2 max that we can't break down fats aerobically. This is just a depiction of the mitochondria, which remember is a little component inside your muscle fiber. So within the sarcoplasm there's a special structure called the mitochondria, and this is where the second and third stage of the aerobic process take place. It's a good word to know, mitochondria. We certainly talk about it more in terms of chronic adaptations later in the year. You wouldn't be surprised to know that if you train aerobically, you increase your number of mitochondria, which gives you greater number of sites to break down fuels aerobically. So that's a very big advantage. So the very simple version of this, and this might be sufficient for you to get through the exam. There haven't been a lot of questions on the chemical pathway. Occasionally there might be a multiple choice that asks you which of the following are byproducts or something like that of a chemical pathway. But keeping it simple, glucose breaks down to pyruvic acid and we get our 2-ATP. That is the anaerobic component. Then what happens is that pyruvic acid with oxygen is moved to the mitochondria. So there's oxygen in the mitochondria. That then breaks down via the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to give us 3 non-fatiguing byproducts and a further 36 ATP. So you can see the massive increase in yield from using oxygen to break down the same fuel that the anaerobic system can use as well. Giving you a slightly more complex version, glycogen to glucose, glucose down to, it says acetyl coenzyme A, it does skip a step there, it's pyruvic acid first. Okay, so the top breaking off of the energy going to the right, that's the anaerobic component. So then what we do is we shift that partially broken down glucose, it converts to something else, it moves to a different part of the cell, the mitochondria, and in that cell, in that part of the cell, the mitochondria, 2 other things happen to it. Suffice to say, collectively, stage 2 and 3 give us a further 36 ATP. So the total yield of ATP from aerobic glycolysis is 38. In biology, you might learn something different. So the aerobic energy system here, that's all the details. Now there's lots more information here because technically you've got carbohydrates, fats and proteins. So you do need to know all of it. Certainly carbohydrates and fats should be forming the bulk of your notes because, as I said, protein is almost irrelevant in energy system use. We've discussed fats and carbohydrates' contributions to energy at rest. Here's just another depiction of that. Showing you that at rest the body with an abundant supply of oxygen breaks down 2/3 of fats to restore sufficient ATP for us to sit upright, do our study, do our reading, whatever else we're doing passively, but that changes significantly as oxygen demand increases as we start to exercise. Okay, one of the more tricky concepts to get your head around is the idea that anaerobic energy systems, both of them, are finite or limited, whereas the aerobic energy system is not. Theoretically, we can work for 5 days and there's still ample fats. In terms of this data in front of you, if you have a look at the white component, while it's called oxygen uptake, that represents the aerobic energy system, and the black component, oxygen deficit, represents anaerobic. If you have a look at the different contributions from the 200 metre event, which is run in 22 seconds, to a 1500 metre event, which takes almost 4 minutes, there is not that much difference in the anaerobic energy system contribution. Now what that means is we only have so much of it that we can use because of the fatiguing byproducts. In the ATP-CP system, we've only got approximately 8 to 10 seconds worth of CP, then it's gone. The anaerobic energy system, once we work at an intensity above lip, our hydrogen ions go through the roof and we have to slow down to use oxygen to clear them. So what we do then is we draw increasingly on the aerobic energy system. Exactly the same content here in basically a coloured graph without the times underneath it. Again, oxygen deficit and oxygen uptake will be explored in a later area of study, but just suffice to say oxygen deficit, where the body has to draw on anaerobic energy systems, and oxygen uptake when the body draws on aerobic energy systems. I'll just make the point that in those 4 athletics events in this particular table, it doesn't mean in the 1500 that we use up all our anaerobic pathways in the first minute. I don't think that's how you run a 1500. You'll go out hard and fast for a bit of time, but it won't be the first minute and a quarter. So the contributions there doesn't necessarily follow that you use it all up in that first chunk before you draw on the next energy system, particularly for the 800 and the 1500. Both would start off with a rapid sprint, significant anaerobic contributions, but you would then be able to draw from those in patches where you're doing a surge or perhaps the finish in your event. Doesn't mean they would be dominant at those time points though.